Oh, Quentin, what you got?
Not much for me. There were some changes to the answer set feature, and big thing last week we'll check in again about is like where to go with some big refactors to the back end of the Weaver. We'll talk about that in our coding meeting today.
Cool. Refactoring. Everyone's favorite thing.
It's nice to have
some
time
people
to do it.
Yes, it's nice
A
to
lot of projects you don't get a chance to refactor.
Yeah. I realized that in some of the stuff we were doing with the Forum Explorer, I'm like, oh, that refactoring I did before was really helpful. I should do some more. It'll eventually get to a nice looking place. All right, cool. Bryce.
Nothing standalone that I think is for management. I think there is the question that is kind of management relevant of do we, which I don't remember if we talked about it all yet, but it was, I think Quentin had raised it at some point last week of like, do we want to try to upgrade production and testing and like what, I think we have vague, like, maybe I'm just not even remembering what the results of those discussions were of like, what do we want test? I think it was like dev, we can update as much as we want. And if it's completely broken, we'll try and get it fixed, but it's okay if it's sort of not on and off. But like, I don't remember if we said we wanted tests to be closer to production or closer to dev in terms of like what Docassemble versions and what package versions we're running. And so that might be, I feel like that's a management-y question. And then the back end question is how do we actually want to go about like updating everything and making sure it's still working? But
so would I be right in thinking that the arguments for or against one or the other probably has something to do with the cadence of our rollout from test to production? Would that be a good way to think about it?
Yeah.
Like if we have if we were having a high throughput, we'd want test to look a lot like production so we could really trust production to look like test look like production. But if our throughput isn't so demanding, then maybe if we have it to development, that gives us a little time to play with new things. Does that sound sort of like I'm just trying to figure out why there isn't or if there is a like simple like test should look like production. What would be the argument for and against?
I guess, Bryce, well, maybe you had some thoughts about it. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, mostly just, I think David covered it essentially of like the arguments for are that, and the arguments for, at least in my, they look stronger to me than I think when we last talked about it because of kiln stuff. But like essentially, if something goes wrong on production, we want something that's similar to it so we can like reproduce the issue not on, if we need to like reproduce the issue, we can reproduce it not on production. And or if we like want to roll out something to production, we move it from dev to test. We go through all of the exact same things using kiln ideally for new stuff. And then if everything is working, then we can put it on production and we know that it will work because the configurations will be as close as possible and all the package versions should be as close as possible too. Those are the arguments for, and I think the arguments against are that it lands us in the situation that we kind of are now, where production is, I don't know, at least 4-5 months behind Docassemble updates, and for sure, like any of our improvements to assembly line, improvements to individual interviews are likely not on production because we haven't updated it in a long time. And having test be closer to production, unless there's like a concerted effort of like one day a month we update the test Docassemble versions and all of the packages and then run through all the tests again and make sure they're good and then do the same production, like it's just not going to happen essentially. That's the only downside, I think. But like I think that might be a downside for either both options though, so I don't really know there. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think, right, because we can't really use test to test that something works reliably. Well, I mean, I think probably the best thing is to have it be close to production. and also to update production regularly so it's not so far behind. And I think to do that, we also need a way to feel confident that when we put something on production, the interviews that are already there won't break. Because what we've been doing for the last year is mostly updating the backend packages. And we've been testing them with, Aleo and Louisiana and the other projects that are part of the broader Pew grant, but we've been producing very few substantive forms on our own. So like really the only thing we've been having to test has been things that change the framework. So we need a really good way to make sure existing interviews don't break with it, because we're not running our own existing interviews for the most part. We're running these kind of more synthetic test interviews.
Do you mean I was going to say, do you mean existing interviews? Because there are two types. It's like update assembly line and we're breaking someone's interview that uses assembly line? Or are you talking about updating an interview and then someone tries to load an older version of the interview and that's broken? Because that's another docassemble issue that is very annoying.
Well, I think we don't have to worry about that as much because that's a very narrow use case and it's going to be the most advanced users who run into it. Very few people actively save old interviews and then want to come back to them, other than maybe people who are advocates and attorneys. So like they know how to reach. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's my sense.
I think seems like
people mostly finish the process. They print it, they download it, or send it in, and then they're done. They don't need to go back to it again later.
And we don't really support our workflow that, what's latently there we do about coming back to save interviews, but that hasn't been a focus. So
we should think about like a better fallback state probably for that, and like how we can make sure people can recover, like the issue that Emily ran into the other day. That was too bad that there wasn't a way to recover from that or to predict it. I don't really know how to make that more robust.
Well, back to the question about updating and cycles and such. Does it sound then like the argument is, well, do these arguments lead towards a thinking where we should use test not just as a way to test interviews that are going to production, but to test our updates, which we would then implement in production? So it's like we want to do an update. First thing we do is we update it in test, make sure it didn't break anything. Then we move that to production, and then by virtue of that workflow, we know that production is always up. But it means that like updating has to be like a shorter term thing than like over a long amount of time. We update this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
I think what we kind of want are it runs tests for every interview. And I think that is something that's more realistic to run every time we want to do a feature upgrade. And we don't necessarily need a full end-to-end test to know that we broke something or not.
So the workflow would be like, there's a new thing that came out, we'll put it on test, we'll kick the tires, then we'll move that to production, being the updates, the underlying updates, not the interviews. So all the interviews are the same between things. And then we can trust that when we take an interview, when we put it on test, that it's going to run fine because they're in sync.
Yeah, I think the kicking the tires is what we would do for a new interview, like a new substantive interview, right? And I think what we really need is a way to automatically make sure when we upgrade things
that we haven't broken,
they don't have some second order effect that we didn't predict yet. And that I feel like should be automated. I don't think we need the full end-to-end test for that either. So I don't know if Kiln
what do you think that looks
lets us do something like that. I think it means opening every interview that's on the server and making sure it doesn't have an error screen. So I feel like that's features we can do with the underlying tools that Kiln uses, which now I'm forgetting which one he uses. It's not Allo, right? What is it?
Puppeteer.
Puppeteer. All right. So yeah, we can do that with Puppeteer. So we just have to it's probably a different kind of test we want to run. Is that what Michael's doing? That's also part of what reminded me of it, thinking of when he runs scheduled tests.
Doesn't this sound like, I don't know, I'm remembering we were doing like different level testings with as automatic things when we were updating. And one of those was just to look if it threw any type of error. Is that
Yep,
Am I remembering that
yep.
wrong?
You just open the interview and see if it runs.
So that's already, is that something in the framework that we could just
Yep.
extend?
Yeah, it's
We don't
it's
need to extend anything.
It's just there.
Running it
Yeah.
in bulk, like the ability to run it in bulk would help, which we don't have right now, but that is something we could just move up in the priority list.
Does it require installing an interview first though, Michelle, or is that something that already lets you just visit a URL and make sure it doesn't have an error? That's really what all we need. don't need to- we
You
don't
don't
wanna
have to
install
install
packages.
the interview. No, it'll just install it on the playground of the automated testing user, and then it'll delete
well,
it.
That's what we don't
that's
want.
still
Yeah.
installing though.
Oh, I see.
We could,
We just want to like
Rewrite
ping it
some-
and see if we get an error, right?
yeah, there is some logic that like is kind of dependent on like running stuff through the playground on like the URL, but ideally none of the actual like once you have the URL to work with, none of the logic is dependent on it being in the playground. I think it's just there is a decent amount of logic that's like, how do we get the like we're passing in all of these things independently in terms of like it's this Docassemble user and it's this API, and we're using the Docassemble API to install it and get the URL to actually go to.
We could make a different action that doesn't run setup or some way to conditionally set an environment variable that doesn't run setup.
Yeah, this feels like this could just be not even like a Kiln thing, but like a script with Kiln
Yeah.
that is
Mhm.
like we open Puppeteer and here's the list of URLs that we, and whether or not it's a GitHub action thing or someone runs it locally, we can figure that out. But I think it's doable, and it's with our knowledge 100% pretty easy, and it's mostly a matter of how much we want to sort of shove it into the other code, and it might be easier to just not shove it into the other code.
Yeah, because I think really we could decide like what we want it to be more than just it loads. But if you're trying to test 20 interviews, it feels like
Yeah.
getting a quick, yeah, everything still opens. That would have been used. That's definitely something that would be
It's a good
helpful
smell
for some
test,
of
yeah.
our interviews.
Yeah, I don't know if Michelle, you still have thoughts there. This is also stuff
No,
we
I
could go
think
we could go
think
into.
it's doable. I like.
Okay.
Don't
And we
see
could
a
also
path to it right now, but like, yeah, we just need to set up a different flow. I think is
All right.
Okay.
a different action.
And I guess
Yes.
making it a GitHub action may not, like you said, Bryce, may not be necessary because we're not going to, there won't be an action triggered that installs the new version on
There-
production. But we
Yeah,
wanna
there's
test
like
it out.
GitHub Actions are very useful for like you add a commit and it triggers. You can do that without it though, and it might just be the best like institutional knowledge place for it to be.
Okay,
It's not a bad because I can't. Otherwise, it's just sort of on one of our three or
Someone
four
has the script locally. And,
computers. Yeah, they
yeah.
run the script, and that's we can document
think
that, but it's just hard to replicate.
I like the
think
idea
I
of
think
it
GitHub
living in
action
one.
actions be
is
scheduled
still the
too,
way to
right? So maybe
go.
we do just want to schedule it to run
Okay.
once a
yeah,
day.
Yep. Can schedule it.
Does that seem,
Yeah,
it's
and
free to us, so
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
there could be a point where it runs out of control and increases our AWS bandwidth maybe, but
Yes, when
I
we
think
have
we
you know
can avoid an
5,000
infinite loop.
interviews, but with our 20
Yes.
interviews now, we're
So-
probably good. Do we? I guess the one thing is we'd probably want to restrict the list of interviews somehow, because there will be things on testing that maybe I don't know, that don't need the same look at. I don't know. I'm just thinking.
well, we
I'm-
could just check for interviews that are published with the API. So there's like a list in
Yeah.
configuration where you say, these are the interviews I want to make available to the public. And we can
I
just
like
make
that.
sure that list is the same ones you want to test, which feels
I
like
like
a
that.
restriction for how we use that list anyway.
Okay, I'll need some details on where we want to store that list and how to access that list, because I mean, like we
So
could
there's
just
an
make a
API
whitelist.
call.
in
Yeah,
the
it
sounds like that
GitHub
list is-
action.
There's an API call you can make that gets the list as a JSON object.
Perfect.
That would, I think, be the way to do it.
Okay,
So we just need
All
a
right.
list of the server URLs
Yeah,
and then call the API, see what interviews are installed, what links to run them from the
I was gonna
API.
say, if we want to nail down exactly what we do in the backend, we can do that. I would mostly just wanted to make sure that like keeping we do want to try to update production to the latest doc assemble there is, and to do that, we want to try and have test be where we run everything, and we either like update doc assemble, run everything, make sure it's good, and then just update it on production too. Just making sure that's nailed down and good.
I go with whatever Quentin says.
Yeah.
Cool.
If
In that
that's
case, I
what we
think that's-
want, then that's something we can start working on.
In that case, I think that's the only
Management.
like management-y thing on my mind right now. So
Cool. Michelle. Management.
Nothing.
Nothing. All right.
I'm management also, I think.
All right, Caroline.
Just no, I don't.
All right. Yeah. One thing that I'll just flag for us to think about is I just want us to be thought, like Bryce has been doing wonderful work with all the e-filing stuff as it comes in and we get into new sandboxes and setting things up. But and I don't anticipate us moving much beyond the groups we have now over the next year. So I think for the next year, we'll probably be at a stasis for like, you know, those half a dozen or whatever. But I want to make sure that if Bryce, if there's anything you need from us, as far as like how to put something institutionally in place so that that future work of maintaining and or adding new folks there is easier. I just want to make sure we go over that. So I mean, it's not necessarily an item for today, but just to put out there for everyone to be thinking about. But mostly
That's
you, Bryce.
yeah, that's fair. And I do actually have, I think I have most of that stuff like written down in the EFSP docs, not like the documentation site, but just sort of like some docs I have in the GitHub repo there. And that I've been using it a lot because I have to revisit like do these things every 3 months or so. And so it's actually been pretty useful. And I've gone through a few edits and improvements of like, oh yeah, I don't do this anymore. We should instead do XYZ. And I think it's mostly a matter of just the best way to knowledge share that, because I know it's probably a bit much to just like, oh, here are all the docs. And so we've had discussions about trying to do.
Yeah, well,
It's
maybe
not
that
necessarily emergency management-y things.
Maybe that
but
becomes
it feels like that's what we should do that with.
yeah, and then maybe it becomes a set of sessions you provide, and then we can attend and you know learn the stuff. I don't know, whatever.
Bring back Teaching Tuesday.
Yeah, bring back Teaching Tuesday.
Yeah.
And then the other thing related to that is that we're about to enter this, you know, change where we go from this as being a thing we've been developing and it's all been in test to having actual e-filing in production, probably sometime in the next 2 months. And I want us to think ahead of, you know, like do a little pre-mortem. So like if something goes wrong, what's the thing that's going to go wrong, right? You know, and can we get ahead of any of that? And just so that if we need to put more, you know, recalibrate resources or something, what would that look like? Just so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where, you know, okay, so the e-filing goes down. What's the failover state, and how is Illinois going to deal with that? So it's just something to think about. So the reason I bring it up here is because obviously, Bryce, you're the one closest to this who can think of things that you need, but we might be the additional resources or might be able to reallocate or move things to deal with that.
I see. Okay. I'm not quite sure how to answer how.
Yeah,
to
you don't need to
reallocate
have the answer now, but it
but
might be like, I think that the most likely thing to happen, the most likely 5 ways things are going to go wrong are this. And I realize now, once I think that you know, the solutions involve us doing X, Y, and Z, but I'm not the best one to do X or Y. So who should be? I mean, this is very sort of nebulous, but I'm trying to get it to be sort of less nebulous. The point is, I'm saying you don't have to do it all yourself, and we should figure out how to spread the load of anything that you see that could be coming down as we shift into production.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'll definitely. That's something that I have like started some conversations like that with Matt, and so I'll keep thinking about that.
All right. Anything else? All right then. we'll let you move into deep dive. Caroline gets to go back and